Inequality starts at the top, argues the UN Secretary-General. Antonio Guterres says the world is at breaking point and calls for a new global deal. Is it possible? And does the pandemic offer a chance for change? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami, Zeidan. Not everyone is in the same boat. The 26 richest people in the world hold as much wealth as half its population. Life chances depend on gender, race, and whether or not a person has a disability. These global inequalities are being made worse by the pandemic, and the world is reaching breaking point. A bleak reality laid bare by the UN Secretary-General. Antonio Guterres has delivered one of the most hard-hitting messages. He says the disparities start with the biggest institutions, and they should be eradicated under a new model of global governance that guarantees a fair share of wealth, opportunity and power.
COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies, the falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver health care for all. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world. The myth that we are all in the same boat. Because while we are all floating on the same sea, it is clear that some are in super yachts, with others are clinging to drifting debris. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought home the tragic disconnect between self-interest and the common interest, and the huge gaps in governance structures and ethical frameworks. To close those gaps and to make the new social contract possible, we need a new global deal to ensure that power, wealth and opportunities are shared more broadly and fairly at the international level. A new model for global governance must be based on full, inclusive and equal participation in global institutions. Without that, we face even wider inequalities and gaps in solidarity, like the fragmented global response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Those top institutions Guterres was speaking about are essentially the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. They were established under the Bretton Woods Agreement reached in 1944 by 44 allied nations. The deal created the post-World War II international monetary system that's replaced the gold standard. The US dollar became the only currency pegged to gold and the reserve to which other currencies were linked. The fixed exchange rate system collapsed in 1971 when the US ended the ability to convert dollars into gold. Let's bring in our panel into the show now. We have joining us from Nairobi, Max Lawson. He's the head of inequality policy at Oxfam. In New Delhi, we have international development economist and Professor Jayati Ghosh. And in London, Alexander Dean. He's the former Chief of Staff to David Cameron when he was the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Welcome to the show. If I can start with Jayati, how do you see the Secretary-General's call for a new global deal? Is it an overdue appeal for some common sense or an idealistic vision that will never become reality?
Well, I absolutely think it's overdue, and I'm very glad that he did actually finally come out and say it, because the idea that it's utopian and can never get translated is really a reflection of our lack of political will and imagination. As he said, we are really at the brink. We cannot afford to delay any longer. The extremes of inequality are such that they're just threatening our societies, our economies. We are unable to cope with a pandemic that we should have been able to deal with quite easily if we had the proper structures in place. We are unable to cope with the existential threat of climate change, and we're basically rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. So I think it's absolutely essential for us to do something immediately, and I think the Secretary-General was absolutely right to highlight the urgency and the necessity for fundamental change.
Rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I like that expression. Let me take it to Max and say, do you agree with that analysis? It's not too idealistic. It's an overdue appeal for us to save ourselves from ourselves.
I think it needs to be said. It's incredibly important. I think before coronavirus hit, we already had an incredibly unequal world where 26 billionaires have the same wealth as the bottom half of humanity. So extremes of wealth that are almost beyond the imagination, more money than anyone can spend in their lifetimes. And then a huge numbers of people living very precarious lives day to day. And that's been hit by this tsunami of the virus, the economic tsunami, the health tsunami. And I mean, here in Kenya, there are hundreds of thousands of people out of work. Everyone's talking about hunger. And yet, even here in Kenya, the rich are doing fine. The government even cut the top rate of income tax. So really, you're seeing an inequality virus, if you can call it that, and it's exploding what was already a very unequal world. So high time people like the Secretary General were talking about this, and high time governments really acted to reduce that gap between rich and poor and build a more equal world after this crisis.
All right, let me take that sentiment to Alexander. Do you agree with all of that? Is this vision really possible to be put into reality?
Well, good news for you. No, I don't agree with that. So we're going to have a debate. I think it's initially hard for the casual observer to figure out quite what the Secretary General is doing until that observer learns that one of his last roles was as president of Socialist International. And I think that that's probably a place that this kind of rhetoric is more suited to be. I think it's a mistake from the Secretary General to be talking like this. The head of an organisation that rises and falls depending on the level of commitment from its member states. And here is the head of the organisation implicitly or explicitly castigating his members at a time when more than ever, some of them are disinclined to take part in multilateral organisations. I think, of course, particularly of President Trump, and given the importance of America's past financial contributions to international organisations, it would seem to me singularly foolish to be suggesting that everything is wrong and that furthermore we should be transforming our economic systems in the kind of way that the Secretary General is saying. But I go you one more. It's not just that I think this is idealistic. It's a set of very tired left-wing tropes, colonialism and the patriarchy and climate change. I mean, basically, this is a left-wing student agenda. And if that's the agenda that the Secretary General wants to pursue, he should try again in elected politics, where, of course, he failed in Portugal in 2002. He should go and try and get himself elected. If you want to implement change in the way that he's suggesting, you should have a democratic mandate for it, rather than failing at the ballot box and then trying to deliver it through international organisations.
All right, I can see Jayati is angling to get in there. I guess you might have something to say about this being the appeal of the Secretary General being nothing more than a set of tired left-wing quotes.
Well, actually, I can't really believe what I've just heard. Are we saying that patriarchy doesn't exist, that colonialism didn't happen, that inequality is not there? Is that what is being said? That if you use these words, that's automatically some left-wing student agenda? I'm actually a little surprised, because I think even the World Economic Forum in Davos, where no doubt Alexander attends very regularly, have all used these words and accepted that these things exist, and that inequality is a very, very serious problem. But
Jayati, let me jump in. It is quite unprecedented.
Is inefficient.
Jayati, how unprecedented is it, though, for a UN Secretary General to speak so openly against the system which many would say he works with, if not represents? I mean, the UN voting rights, doesn't Alexander have a point when he says, you know, you're taking a bit of a gamble when you speak out against the very institution you're representing?
Well, I think it's really just a question of recognizing, I mean, this is really an indication of how far global power and how right-wing everything is. Because Secretary Generals in the past have used much stronger language. If you go back to Hammarskjöld or Juthant, I mean, they used much, much stronger language, actually. So it's really a question of the fact that we now have in power regimes in the United States and in England, etc., which are unwilling to give an inch and are openly and blatantly representing the interests of very small elites in their countries, and are willing to take all international institutions actually to crush them in their path if they are unable to fix that agenda.
Let me give Alex a quick chance to come in, and then I know Max has something to say, and we'll go to Max. Alex, very quickly.
Well, I think there is a problem and there is an answer. The problem isn't as it's been outlined by my fellow panelists who believe that we live in terrible inequality, when actually quality of life and length of life for people around the world has increased remarkably thanks to capitalism and free trade. The problem we face is a declining...
Isn't that being threatened now, I think is the point of the other panelists. The sort of numbers that Max is telling us is that, yeah, that may have been achieved, but now it seems like the curve is going down with a handful of people having more or as much money as half the world.
Forgive me, the problem that we face is economic nationalism and protectionism. It's not the suggestion that we should try to smuggle through left-wing policies of so-called equalisation, which you wouldn't be able to deliver at the ballot box if you actually offered it to people. This is actually a very modern phenomenon, I think. If you can't deliver it through democracy, don't worry, create or go to an international institution, get a Greta Thunberg type to endorse you, and try to deliver anyway through the climate change and pandemic Trojan horses, left-wing policies that if you gave people a chance, they wouldn't vote for.
All right, Max, go ahead.
I think, I find myself agreeing a bit with Alexander in saying that the Secretary General is being brave. I think if we look at the quality of the world's leaders and the juxtaposition between the leaders of most countries and the scale of the problems humanity faces, there could not be a huger gap. We've got right-wing demagogues who clearly don't know how to govern, clearly don't know what to do in the face of a crisis, doing terrible, terrible things. So it does show leadership. I agree in that these are your sponsors, but the true definition of leadership is to speak up and say what needs to happen. If I could just say something more on the popularity. I mean, we at Oxfam and others, organisations like the universities in New York, have looked at polling around the world before coronavirus and after coronavirus. And some of these policies, for instance, greater taxation of the rich to help pay for the COVID recovery. We saw millionaires coming out in favour of that last week, and that's a massively popular policy. So if it was put to the ballot box, it would be picked up.
Max, let me jump in and present to you an argument. All right, Alex wants, so let Alex do it.
On the healthcare. So if you look at the polling,
if you want those policies, deliver it democratically. If you want those policies, you should.
Something like universal healthcare is not.
All right, let's give Alex a chance, then I'll let you come back in on that, Max. Go ahead, Alex.
If you want to tax the rich more heavily, perhaps much more heavily, as you're implying, then run for office, win office, and implement your policies. And if you're unwilling to do it yourself, convince a political party to do so and campaign for them, rather than just saying that the international community should somehow be this unelected world government.
All right, let's give Max a chance.
Oh, I completely find myself agreeing with you more than I expected. I think the real battleground for these policy issues is the nation state, and it has to be democratic. But where I do disagree with you is the sense that these are in some way not popular policies, because I think the polling belies that, and I think coronavirus has really contributed to that. People see that everyone is at risk. They see the necessity for things like universal health coverage in the face of a pandemic. They see that government can intervene when it wants to help people who are facing unemployment. They want to see more of that after coronavirus. They do not want to go back to the bad old days. They want a new normal, and they want to use that spirit to confront climate change too.
We've got some questions. We've got some questions coming up about what the new normal might be, but I can see Jayati. Before we get into that, I want you to speak to perhaps one comeback to that sort of narrative which we heard from the Secretary General, the idea that, you know, the one that even we've heard now from Max, that there is a terrible wealth gap and it's growing. What do you say to those who say, as Alex pointed out, well, overall, the indicators, even for that, even if we say, you know, there are a few rich people who are getting richer and the gap is getting bigger between them and the rest of us have seen their standard of living improve, have seen their life longevity improve, even if the gap between the rest of us and the super rich is getting bigger?
No, let's forget about the long term or even the medium term. We're talking about what is happening now. And what we do know now,
well, I think that the argument is about now.
The point is exactly that we have in India probably a doubling of the poverty rate. We have hundreds of millions of people who have lost jobs and livelihood. We've had a dramatic decline in real wages. There's an increase in hunger, in absolute hunger, just in my own country. And I'm not even talking about very many countries in Africa and elsewhere.
Jayati, are you talking about just since the pandemic, or are we talking about a longer time scale?
I'm talking about the last 7 years when there was an absolute fall in employment, according to official data, and an increase in hunger. This is before the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic has made a dramatic increase in hunger and in poverty. So yes, things are not necessarily better in the last few years for a very large number of the people in our country. And in this same period, we have had the top 1% absolutely double their incomes and their wealth. If you just put a 4% tax on 965 people in India, that's all, just 965 people, a 4% tax on their wealth, which they wouldn't even notice, you actually can double health spending in this country. And we are massively underfunding basic health right now during the pandemic. We don't have beds, we don't have nurses, we don't have hospitals, we don't have basic medical kits. I mean, it's really appalling, the level of scarcity. So it's really easy to do, and there is huge popular support. The point I just want to make is that, it's right, there is a whole democratic process and so on, but governments, get elected for various reasons. It's a very complicated process, the electoral one, as I'm sure all of us know. And it doesn't mean that you have carte blanche to do everything you like in any which way for 5 years. It really means that you must respond to democratic needs and to desperate crises when people are actually going through them. And definitely for things like this, if you did a referendum for a wealth tax, I'm pretty sure you'd get overwhelming support in India, probably in the UK, certainly in the US, we know, the polls show that there is overwhelming support.
Okay. Alex, do you think some world powers might now perceive the Secretary General to be a bit of a nuisance, if not a threat?
Yeah, I do. And I tend to think that these roles, especially in times like this, are better used as convening roles in which people are brought together and shepherded in a direction rather than scolded and castigated and told that they're doing things wrong. To be clear, I think, I wonder what my fellow panelists think, I think it is more likely that the Americans disengage from the UN because of this kind of rhetoric rather than less likely. And I think when you start thinking about things like that, we should be looking more at a convening rather than a scolding leadership.
Do you think, Alex, we might see an effort to oust him after his first term, a la Guterres who was ousted after his first term, after annoying, well, one world
Good
power
question.
in particular?
And I don't know the inside baseball of the nominating process well enough. But and of course, they would also run the risk of being seen of targeting him because of this kind of speech, which, as this conversation makes clear, for some people will be popular. So I think in some ways he may have bolstered his own position in terms of staying there, but I think he's making himself a lot less useful. And in the end, you've got to wonder, what are these roles for? Do you actually want to achieve something, or do you want to lecture people until your time in office finishes?
That's a good point. Let's take it to Max. As a person, you work with Oxfam, an organisation that tries to help people in need. When you hear the Secretary General speak like that, I'm sure one part of you is very happy with that. Does it worry you, though, the point which Alex is making, that it might prompt powerful countries like the US towards more disengagement that undermines the sort of policies you are working on?
Again, I think Alex has a point. I think, what we've seen since the crisis broke is almost complete failure of multilateralism and the unprecedented situation where the US under, a demagogue president from the right is turning his back on the world and turning his back on the World Health Organization. If anything, and probably the Secretary General is speaking like this through desperation. I'm absolutely sure he has worked incredibly hard to try and convene people. But as we have seen, we're living in a situation where the most powerful man on earth is like a playground bully. So people have to speak up. So I think it would be much, much better. And maybe we hope for a change of government in the US, much, much better, as we saw after the financial crisis under the leadership of Gordon Brown and Obama, to convene, and then for the most powerful nations to do the right thing, and particularly for poor nations, because things like debt crises or huge increase in poverty. There's an estimate that 500 million people could be pushed into poverty by this crisis. And I see that every day here in Kenya, that the level of hunger in the slums here in Nairobi is unprecedented. So that requires concerted global action by the most powerful nations. And we just haven't seen that in the last few months. So I think probably the Secretary General is exasperated.
Let me let Jayati into the discussion and ask you, could we interpret the support which some rich countries now are giving to people, you know, had lost their livelihoods due to the pandemic as a move towards some of the principles the Secretary General was talking about, you know, the idea of universal basic income? Is there any sliver of optimism there?
I think the developed countries have certainly responded very significantly, fairly large fiscal measures, including a lot of income support, including unemployment assistance, including, you know, various measures like that. I think that has not been equivalent in developing countries, partly because of various inequalities, that the much lower fiscal space, the large debts that many of them bear, the complete collapse in tax revenues, etc. So it's been a very uneven response. Most developing countries have not provided that kind of support and assistance. In India, there's been practically nothing provided to the hundreds of millions who've lost livelihood. But I think it's a bigger point, you know, the point that was being discussed earlier, that has the Secretary General undermined himself. Could his position be any worse than it already was? Isn't the UN already basically treated as irrelevant? And isn't it the fact that the US practically has almost stopped all financial support as well? It's really become little more than a kind of desperate talking shop in which they're so keen to keep those big powers happy that they will not say anything that goes against the interests
that's
of
a good point.
the large part. So I think, you know, I mean, finally, if he's telling it like it is, it's not as if it's going to make the situation worse, because it was already so bad. If anything, it will actually make many other people take the UN a bit more seriously.
You made a good point there. Let me take it to Alex and say, you know, it's difficult, Alex, to see a scenario in which world powers unilaterally give up their dominant positions in global institutions to further the notions of equality, right? And while, Alex, you know, you talk about how this sort of agenda needs to be sorted out in the democratic space, many would argue some of the institutions that pursue this kind of policy around the globe, well, they're not entirely democratic, right? They have positions which are appointed through realpolitik and power. Isn't it necessary to have a bit of a wake-up call or scream from the Secretary General?
Well, your point there is right, but in the end, I suppose my answer is towards the democratic discussion that we were having, and we sort of had agreement on. If in the end, for example, we think that the Security Council should be restructured and that the permanent 5 nations should have their positions changed somehow in the makeup of the way that the United Nations is administered, then surely the smart thing to do is to bolster and assist movements in those countries which advocate a more democratic and an open-minded and less controlled position at the United Nations, which could then be proposed in the UN and potentially change the Charter. Instead, the person who's at the very head of this organisation is making these kinds of sweeping statements and dismissive statements that just mean he's less likely to be listened to. I agree with what's been said about the fact that the UN seems pretty irrelevant already, but I am surprised to see its Secretary General so keen to confirm that irrelevance.
All right, we've got some strong opinions. I'm afraid we are out of time, though. Let's thank our guests. Very sorry that we could go on endlessly on this, but for now we really have to thank our guests. Thank you so much, Mac Lawson, Jayati Ghosh, and Alexander Dean. Perhaps we'll be back. Don't worry, guys. We'll be back to discuss this again soon. You can watch the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.